Well, good morning. It's good to be here. It's not good to be here talking about why spotted wilt was such a problem for us. It's one of those things. I've been here dealing with spotted wilt for about 33 years, and I have to say that there was a whole lot of 2022 in some of my own plots, as well as some of the grower fields that I either saw pictures of or was in directly, that took me back to 1997 when we were seeing some of the worst problems ever with that. So spotted wilt was a major challenge. I mean, that's no news to anybody here in 2022. I'm afraid I can't tell you the whys of it, but the one thing that I do know was both in Georgia, since spotted wilt's been a problem, as well as anywhere in the world where spotted wilt's been a problem on any crop, there have been major fluctuations over time, and I think that's one of the things that we're dealing with. Dr. Kimmerwright may talk about the INSA fluctuations, the El Nino, La Nina cycle and such. That could be a factor. The thrips population dynamics, the level of the virus in the populations, all come into play. I don't have a definitive answer for it, but I do know that pressure has been going up over the last couple of years. One thing we are asked about, especially with the varieties we have, Georgia 06G in particular, is has it played out? Has it been overcome by the virus? Is that part of it? One thing I do believe is the resistance that we have has never been a complete level of resistance. It seems to be multigenic. I think it has been stable, but it has not been overcome from a genetic standpoint by the virus. But what can happen, and we've seen this going back as long as we've been looking at resistance in the field with spotted wilt, it can be overwhelmed. It's not a true high level of resistance in terms of can handle any amount of inoculum that the virus might have, any number of virulifera strips that might feed on it. And one of the things that this is just a historical revisitation I do from time to time. In 2022, I planted FlowRunner. Some of you may be old enough to remember that. Quite a few of you probably not. But that was the predominant variety we had. This is not FlowRunner, but Sonolake 97R, which was just as susceptible as FlowRunner. That was a couple years ago. We planted, this was Tifgard that it was growing next to. So it's one of those things that I do believe our resistance is still viable. I don't think it's been overcome by genetic changes in the virus. Dr. Bagg, Dr. Srini Baisan, they've been looking at the genetics of the virus. We don't think there's been any directional changes that would explain for the higher level of pressure, but just the amount of inoculum that our varieties are exposed to, and in some places in 2022, even 06G, at least in parts of a field, looked more like this. Unfortunately, the symptoms of spotted wilt were all too familiar in 2022. We had a upswing in the losses. The black line is the percent losses, and I don't have the dollar loss value, but I expect it will be up as well. But over these last few years, been up considerable compared to what we were looking at back in around 2010, the years around that. Again, I think part of that is just a natural fluctuation in the pressure of the virus, but I don't have an explanation for that. I do believe that resistant varieties and integrated management with those are the secrets for keeping spotted wilt in check. And as bad as things were in spots in 2022, I shudder to think of what things would have looked like had we been dependent upon a variety like FlowRunner, or like Sonolake 97R, even something like Georgia Green, which was an amazing variety that responded to integrated management. But I think we would have been in really big trouble had we been dealing with any of those in 2022. But just going back to 2019, which was a heavy pressure year as well, the differences in the varieties were obvious. We think of O6G now as a lot of times as our susceptible check, but that is, it's still a very useful resistant variety from a field resistance standpoint. But in 2019, Georgia 12Y, Tough Runner 297, TIF NV High OL, and AU NPL all separated out from 16HO and 18RU and O6G. Again, a heavy pressure year in 2019. We still maintained good yields though, and the one thing obvious in 2019 all the way up through this year in 2022 is, regardless of the variety we're growing under the heavier pressures, we are seeing a really nice decrease in level of spotted wilt with the use of thimet, borate, insecticide in furrow, and in most cases a substantial yield increase as well. So this is 2019. The yields, pressure was down some in 2020, but a similar trend, and we did have a higher level in Tough Runner 331 that year, but a huge response to thimet. Again, significant response across most of the varieties. I don't know what happened in 16HO that year. In 2021, similar trend with a little heavier pressure, with still good yields, and in most cases a very noticeable yield increase with the addition of thimet. In 2022, our pressure again was the heaviest that we've had in our plots since 2010, or even going back to well before that, when we were out of beyond the earliest use of O6G. But in our non-treated plots, we had incidents in Georgia O6G that were approaching 50%. Tough Runner 511 is about the most susceptible thing that we're dealing with now in terms of variety. But high incidence in a lot of these entries. 12Y separated out better than O6G, as did the new TIF NV HG, the AU NPL. Both of those have looked good for us. But one of the most striking things in 2022 was the largest response to thimet insecticide that I've dealt with. I don't know I don't have an explanation for why the pressure was so much higher in 2022. I don't have a good explanation for why we saw the response to thimet that we did. But for just comparisons, I've got rid of the 511 to show that, but almost a 50% reduction in incidence in O6G with a thimet, with a regular TIF NV, an even greater percent response, and then a really nice response even in something with the resistance level of Georgia 12Y. One thing that we've seen is Tough Runner 297 doesn't look to have the field resistance that Georgia 12Y has, but in a lot of cases it seems to have an additional tolerance. So if we look at the yields, that was it, and the TIF NV HG with thimet were the highest yields that we had in the test. But a nice response yield-wise, even in Georgia 12Y, to the addition of thimet, but in some of the others, even larger responses. So again, heavier pressure, even in the most resistant varieties that we've got in 2022. Again, I don't have a good explanation for that. But I do think that all of them have a very useful and very critical level of resistance that we have to depend on. Varieties is still our first line of defense against spotted wilt. The responses that we've seen to thimet across the years, an indication of the still continual importance of an integrated management regime to take care of spotted wilt. Again, back to the concerns about loss of resistance or overcome the resistance in O6G. This is a plot of the losses in percent losses in the black line, and the percent of incidence of spotted wilt in O6G in our plots going back to 2007 was the first year that we had O6G. And in that year, it was a really heavy pressure year. We had incidence there that was higher than we've had typically in O6G for most of those years up until this 2019 and 2021. And going from 25 to 45, it's a huge jump. I still don't think it's a genetic factor in terms of the virus, just an overwhelming level of inoculum and such. But even early on, we knew that Georgia O6G was not immune to the virus. It showed that it could have a high incidence, and certainly one that needs additional help, especially in years with heavy pressure. In most years, we don't have a good predictor as far as how heavy the pressure will be across the region. So we have to assume the worst, I think, in terms of addressing that. But even going back to the early days of O6G, we saw in our plots in Tifton, it was even worse in Mariana at that time, that it could be not overcome from a genetic standpoint by the virus, but overwhelmed with just the level of inoculum. Again, this was our plots with O6G in 2022. I'll just show one rep, but all four of them had similar results. This is one where we planted the Thimet and non-treated side by side. And again, one of the largest responses to Thimet that we've ever seen with a lot of the varieties in 2022. One thing I will point out, all the varietal Thimet data that I've shown so far, we pretty much do everything wrong. Everything that we know how to do to maximize the spotted wilt, we plant as early as possible. We use a thinner, a sparser seeding rate. I'm a spoonerist, but sometimes I get things twisted up even when I'm trying to talk right. But we use a sparse seeding rate. We plant early. We use conventional tillage, single rows, and no additional insecticide other than the Thimet that we use. So it's dependent upon the varietal resistance, and in this case, the Thimet. So again, a huge factor, two huge factors we're dealing with, the variety and insecticide in furrow. Even bigger response in Tough Runner 511. Again, Tough Runner 511 was really too susceptible to expect too much of in the situation that we were using, but it's a great research tool, but it was really hit non-treated, and we saw it was quite a remarkable response to Thimet. In fact, Tough Runner 511 does not even look like the same variety with Thimet as compared to without it under any pressure of spotted wilt at all. We do look at other insecticides. Dr. Abney will talk about those more, but again, just basically the only insecticide that we've seen that gives us anything close to a consistent suppression of spotted wilt has been Thimet. This was done on 511 with a little bit later planting date, so we didn't have quite the pressure, but a nice response to Thimet compared to the non-treated check. We do get some suppression sometimes with Aldicarb, but there are actually times with Aldicarb and imidacloprid where sometimes we'll even see a larger incidence than without it. But again, the Thimet is the only insecticide we have now that gives us a consistent response in terms of managing spotted wilt. Quite a few of these will do a good job on thrips control, but if you're looking for thrips control and spotted wilt, really we only have the one option right now. Again, heavy losses in 2022, but this gives the history. We still haven't gotten quite up to the point that we were in the worst year in 1997 before Georgia Green came on the scene, before the tomato spotted wilt index was developed and adapted. But one thing, I used the historic data to point out, Georgia Green was released there in '96. Took a while for it to build up acreage-wise. The first spotted wilt risk index was developed and released in 1997. Dr. Bug Brown's in the audience. It's great to have him here reminisce about that and the impact of it. By the next year, we had 75% Georgia Green, which was a huge shift, but we also had a huge shift in planting date. By then, we had less than 5% of our acreage planted before April 26th. This was a much later shift in planting and a lot of swapping up, planting cotton versus peanut. But with a variety like Georgia 06G, had a moderate level of resistance, but it was absolutely essential to put as many things together as possible. Then by the next year, we're 95% Georgia Green, but then by the early 2000s, we were less than 2% planted before May 1st. With the planting date effect that I saw in our plots in 2022, I think that could be huge, could have been huge in a year like this as well. So just point this out, that in the past with something like Georgia 06G, I think we were paying more attention to putting together the total package, the integrated package that's talked about, and Dr. Kimmerwright will talk about Peanut RX, and especially the spotted wilt part of that in the future.